In the 1910s, a mysterious illness started its journey across the globe, affecting millions of people and killing about 1/3 of them. But this wasn't your standard illness. This came with a baffling set of symptoms that scientists still don't have an answer for to this very day. In many, it caused them to sleep, a deep, deep sleep from which you would either never wake up, or if you did wake up, you'd never truly feel awake again. This is a disease formerly known as encephalitis lethargica, or sometimes von Economo's disease, named after the man who first described it in 1917, neurologist Konstantin von Economo. But you might also know it as the sleeping sickness or sleepy sickness. If you've ever tuned in to one of my medical mystery episodes before, you'll know that this is truly where my nerd brain shines. After being diagnosed with severe scoliosis as a 16-year-old, something that is also considered somewhat of a medical mystery, in most cases no one really knows where scoliosis happens, I just became fascinated with medicine and its history. And when there's a mystery to dissect, all the better. Encephalitis lethargica started in the mid-1910s and continued through to around 1927-1928, where it just disappeared as quickly as it began, and no one knows why. What caused these very strange symptoms? Where did it come from? Why did it disappear? Or do some today still suffer with encephalitis lethargica? Could it be partially to blame for World War II? Could it be to blame for millions of deaths? Let's explore all of that and more. And all of this is a perfect segue into talking about today's sponsor, Emma. But for that, you need to join me in the bedroom. Welcome to my bedroom. It feels oddly personal to have you guys in here, but here we are. This video, as I said, is sponsored by Emma, and they have sent me a new duvet to try out, and I'm so excited. So this is the Cloud Duvet by Emma, and I am so excited. First of all, I've got this in a king size, and my old duvet, I've got a king size duvet cover. The duvet inside is not a king size. I don't know what happened, but I bought the wrong size 2 years ago now. 2 years ago, and I haven't replaced it. So we've had the wrong size duvet in the wrong size duvet cover for years now, and it's been driving me insane. So I'm so excited to finally have the right size duvet. Sir, do you mind? Do you mind? Can I? Okay, thank you. Oh, Rhubarb's come up to try it. Can I help you, sir? Can I help you? When I tell you this duvet is so soft and so, like, cloudy. It is given the right name. Like, a cloud duvet is what it is. It is, like, so squishy, and I'm so excited to curl up tonight and, like, sleep underneath it. This duvet is made of microfiber, so it is super soft. It is designed with your comfort in mind, honestly. I can see it. I've got makeup on, I don't want to get makeup on it, but it's so cozy. This is designed to provide the exact right amount of warmth without overheating you. I don't know the science that goes into something like that, but honestly, I need it so bad. I am somebody who overheats at night so bad. I get so hot, so sweaty at night. Whilst my fiance, she is always cold. Like, she is always freezing no matter what. So I'm very intrigued to see how this works out for the two of us. Oh, and good news, it is also machine washable, so that is always handy. Emma currently have 30% off their big bank holiday sale, which runs through to the end of May. I also have a code that will give you a further 5% off that as well. My code is very easy to remember. It is literally just Georgia Marie, or you can follow the link in the top line of the description box down below and just go and check out Emma. I mean, you do literally spend half your life asleep, so why wouldn't you invest in these kinds of things? Like a good quality duvet, a good quality mattress, good quality pillows. It makes such a difference to your quality of sleep. You know when you go to a hotel and you crawl into bed and you're like, oh my god, I feel like I'm on a cloud, this is like the best thing ever. Why can't we have that every night? Why? Why can't we have that every night of our lives? It's the big question. If you buy one of Emma's mattresses, you get a 200-day trial, so if you don't like it at any point for whatever reason, you can just send it back. And you don't even need to worry about like getting it back into the packaging that it came in. You can literally just like wrap it in plastic, stick it on your doorstep, and Emma will literally come and like pick up and take it away for you. Like, that's so good. You get free delivery and free returns. There's literally no hidden cost. This is high quality materials. Like, it's all so soft, so plush, so nice. And it's also award-winning. Like, this is award-winning bedding. Just go check it out. As you can see, Rhubarb, our award-winning loafer, very much approves of it. What do you think? Do you like it? I think she does. Our encephalitis lethargica story, I think we're going to call it EL for the rest of this video because it's a bit of a mouthful, begins in and around Vienna, Austria in the winter of 1916 to 1970, when a mysterious new illness suddenly appears. Now, in this time, communication was obviously a lot slower, much more sporadic than it is nowadays, and as you'll come to see, the symptoms of this illness vary hugely. So it's not entirely out of the question that symptoms may have appeared in other cities before this point, but Vienna is where we have our first confirmation that this is where EL first appeared. The aforementioned neurologist Konstantin von Economo published a paper in April 1917 in which he described this very weird illness he'd encountered over the winter. And within just a number of days, a French doctor called Jean-René Cruchet also published his own paper about the bizarre symptoms that he was seeing in France. Completely separate, they just happened to notice it at the same time. A lot of the sufferers had been diagnosed with varying diseases by their doctors, but von Economo noticed a pattern between the symptoms. All of them had headaches, mild fevers, and malaise, just this general feeling of discomfort. This could have been, and was in many cases, just brushed off as influenza. The Great Influenza or the Spanish influenza pandemic was just about to begin at this point, but von Economo found that people didn't really have the symptoms that you'd usually associate with the flu. There was no high fever, no myalgias or muscle pains, and no upper respiratory problems. They just generally didn't feel right. The patients would often have expressionless, mask-like faces in the early stages, and each would become increasingly drowsy until they fell into a deep, deep sleep, from which in the early days they could easily be woken up, but then as soon as the sort of stimulation stopped, they'd be straight back asleep. It was reported that people could literally be halfway through chewing a mouthful of food, and they would just fall asleep. In that moment, food's still in their mouths. This sleepiness would usually last for a week or two, and after that point it would either continue to get worse until the sufferer fell into a coma and eventually died, or it would simply just get better until the person recovered. But even then, they'd never really reach their pre-illness level of energy, they'd just be able to function normally. Von Economo also noted palsies in his patients, defined by paralysis accompanied by involuntary tremors. He noted that the eyes especially would twitch a lot, a characteristic that he noted consistently across all sufferers. As time went on, the extremities would get weak or even hypertonic, showing decreased muscle tone. But then in some other people, the opposite would happen. The muscles would develop rigidity. They'd be unable to move or bend at all. All of that I just described was just one form of sleeping sickness though, the somnolent ophthalmoplegic form. Ophthalmoplegic. I have literally spent the last 10 minutes trying to pronounce that word. Ophthalmoplegic. Hopefully that's right. It's this form that was found in Vienna that winter, and it's most often what we think of when we think of EL. But it would become clear over the coming years that there are also two more kinds of it as well, hyperkinetic and amyostatic akinetic form. Now these three distinct types of EL are kind of what made it so hard to pin down for such a long time, because all the symptoms between these three forms are very different. You see, in hyperkinetic forms, instead of sleepiness, you're dealing with restlessness instead, motor disturbances of the body such as twisting or jerking muscles, and even an anxious, sometimes very frenzied mental state. Sufferers of this form would have severe back and neck pain and weakness as well, and in a complete 180, insomnia or sleep inversion were very common symptoms. Instead of a very deep sleep, you just simply couldn't sleep, or you'd become nocturnal. You would sleep all throughout the day, and then you'd be awake all night. Yeah, you can kind of see why this is still a mystery to this day. This is all under the same umbrella, literally opposite symptoms. In the initial stages of the hyperkinetic form, more people would die with sudden death occurring at any point, and if you did survive, you'd often get the somnolent form anyway. Eventually you would begin to get sleepy. And the final form of EL is the amyostatic akinetic form, which is the least common one to get, but is the one that if you survived, and you were quite likely to survive, you'd probably suffer with chronic symptoms for the rest of your life, namely Parkinsonism. You'd get a bit of sleep inversion, some eye twitching and some weakness, and then you'd probably have post-encephalitic Parkinsonism for the rest of your life. The term Parkinsonism is an umbrella term used to cover a range of conditions that share similar symptoms to Parkinson's disease, but it doesn't just refer to Parkinson's. You're talking slowed movements, tremors, stiffness or rigidity, unstable posture or gait, a hunched posture, and freezing. Parkinsonism is not great, it's a horrible thing to have, and a lot of people who had EL and survived would have chronic Parkinsonism for the rest of their lives. Not every person would have every symptom, of course, and people would suffer at varying severities. The fact they were even able to make links at all in a lot of cases was actually pretty impressive. So, you're probably wondering about mortality rates, and honestly, so am I. Each source I looked at gave me very different numbers. As we know, this is a mysterious illness. Data wasn't kept as well back in the 1910s, 1920s as it is now. So to put it simply, no one has a solid answer for anything here, but the most common numbers I found were that EL killed 1/3 of the people it affected, another third were left permanently disabled, maybe with chronic Parkinsonism, and the last third, well, I assume they got away scot-free. The patients that died mostly died from respiratory failure caused by neurological dysfunction. The brain basically stopped being able to tell your lungs to breathe for you, like they were in that deep of a coma. And for some, they wouldn't die, but they would just remain in a coma-like state for many, many years. They found that the epidemics tended to peak in the winter months, very similar to a cold or flu type illness, whereas it was very rare to get EL in the summer. All ages would be affected, it didn't really discriminate, but most people tended to be between 20 and 40. In the early days, a lot of doctors tended to misdiagnose EL as the symptoms of polio, but it soon just became very clear that that just didn't really fit. We know that EL ran from around 1917 to about 1927, 1928, and the number of people affected in the 10-ish year span of this illness is thought to be more than 1 million. We know that it likely started in Europe and then spread around the entire globe. In Europe, it was much more virulent through October 1918, sort of like January 1919, but in the USA, it peaked in the early 20s. And then in 1927, it just disappeared. Even by me just saying that this spread, you would assume this to be a contagious disease, a bacterial or viral infection jumping from person to person. But they don't know that for sure. In fact, most scientists say that EL was not contagious at all. There were some situations reported in which only single people in packed houses would get ill, whereas other times entire children's home would come down with it in just a matter of days. Good news though for kids, they were much less likely to die from this, so that's something. They still, to this day, have no idea why people got it when they did. Even modern scientific analysis of brain tissue samples preserved from this time have given us no further answers, like this is a true medical mystery. There are some theories though, of course. Lots of people have made connections to the Spanish influenza epidemic that reared its head around the same time, although the EL symptoms seem to start around the end of 1916 and the Spanish influenza didn't really come around until 1918. There is a little bit of leeway with those dates, but it still sort of pulls into question. Like Spanish influenza may have been around a lot longer before it really took hold, but we don't know. What we do know is there were countless cases of EL in France and England in early 1918, which is months before the influenza pandemic started, but there is evidence that the influenza virus had been mutating in mammals for quite a few years before it jumped to humans, so it can't be entirely discounted. It was hanging around. The virus, it was there in nature. I don't know. So some scientists think that EL may have been an autoimmune response to the influenza, that it caused the body to somewhat attack the brain in a very specific way that caused these symptoms. But if that's the case, how has this never happened again? The symptoms of these two diseases only overlapped like the tiniest bit. They were so incredibly different. And besides, so many of the people suffering with EL never reported having influenza. There just wasn't that much overlap between the people who got these two diseases. But the idea that it could have been just an after effect of influenza did kind of make sense at the time. There was no other obvious factors to consider here. And this is generally the accepted theory nowadays, like this is what your general layperson will think, even though so many scientists have debunked this over the years. I mean, both epidemics did start and end around the same time, so they've always been intrinsically linked in like the public opinion, but there's actually no scientific link between them. They've never been able to find anything. In looking at the brains of people who had died from EL, there wasn't anything that visually distinguished this specific encephalitis from any other form, but the symptoms were so different. They could see some congestion of the vessels, they could see markings on the brainstem, but generally there's nothing that explained these specific symptoms. Since 1918, there have been plenty of viruses identified that can cause encephalitis. Not this particular form, but encephalitis basically just refers to inflammation of the brain, usually caused by an infection or an autoimmune problem. There are so many different types of encephalitis. This specific one, still a mystery. Like when categorizing this specific type of encephalitis EL, you're looking for small outbreaks in late winter or early spring, no evidence of direct contagion, death in up to 50% of cases, and often chronic Parkinsonism as an after effect. And this has never happened again. Like, this disappeared in 1927, and we've never really seen it since. They've looked at arthropods, at insects, and they have found arboviruses in them that could meet the above criteria. We know that arboviruses can cause epidemics of encephalitis, but this exact one? We don't know. I mean, this could account for the lack of evidence of contagion though, like most people don't notice when they've been bitten by a bug, or at least it doesn't remain at the forefront of your mind forever. It could explain why just one person or a whole family could be infected. You could just have one rogue bug bite, or you could have a bug going around just munching on everyone in a family. However, it has been pointed out that bugs don't really tend to come out in late winter and early spring. Diseases spread by an arthropod vector are usually much more often found in late summer or maybe early autumn. So that one thing just doesn't really explain it. It also doesn't really explain why it would just suddenly stop around 1927, but nothing explains that. Like, these bugs didn't just suddenly disappear in 1927 without anyone noticing. Something else I've seen speculated across the internet is that this was maybe caused by a toxin of some kind, maybe a drug some people were taking, maybe a household product, maybe it was environmental. But again, why would it start and stop so suddenly? If it was a toxin, they've certainly never found it. It's not like it was pulled from production. Like, what was this? Some researchers nowadays do believe that this was the body's immune response to an infection, like streptococcus or influenza, just any infection at all, and that resulted in damage to the basal ganglia. But that's not set in stone, that is just a theory. Again, no one knows why it suddenly began or ended. They're theorising this, there's no actual evidence of it. So yeah, when I say EL is a mystery, I mean it. This disease has absolutely baffled scientists for 100 years now. And whilst we've not had another epidemic of this in nearly a century, there are thought to have been sporadic one-off cases over the years. Kinda, maybe, the diagnostic criteria for EL has never been entirely agreed upon by modern day doctors, but if a patient's symptoms cannot be attributed to any other neurological condition, and they do show this like hypersleepiness, paralysis of the eye muscles, and psychiatric changes, they'll usually diagnose. But I struggle to find any actual specific examples to share with you. It seems to be really, really rare. But saying that, there actually are examples of other similar epidemics throughout history. In 1580, a disease spread across Europe that caused severe lethargy and led to Parkinsonism. In 1673 to 1675, there was something called febris comatosa. You don't need to speak Old English to deduce what that meant. In Germany in 1712, there was a severe epidemic of schlang... oh no. Okay, wait a sec, let's try and do this German. Schlafkrankheit? Schlafkrankheit? That might be right. Which apparently translates directly to sleep sickness. I don't speak German, I don't know that, somebody check that for me. And this caused a severe slowness of movement in the aftermath, so once you'd recovered, you would just be a very slow person. And so on. There was at least one reported outbreak or epidemic of some form of sleepy sickness in each century up until now, which scares the shit out of me. Honestly, before COVID, pandemics and epidemics like this seem to be something in the past, something which can't happen in the modern day. I used to read and research about things like this in fascination, and now when I research it, I'm always slightly scared. Like, it feels like something that's very much possible, and before COVID, it didn't feel possible, it didn't feel real. I assume all of us have just got like a low level of trauma from that time. Like 2020, bad time. Bad time for me. Bad time for everyone. So I feel like I've adequately covered the mystery of this disease, and I could leave it here, but I'm me, so I'm not going to do that. I teased at the beginning of this episode about how encephalitis lethargica may have had an impact on World War II, and in my research I thought this was just too interesting to brush past. The butterfly effect of history is just so fascinating to me. Like, if one thing had been different at any point in the past, how would the world look different today? For example, if Hitler hadn't potentially had encephalitis lethargica, how would the world look different? Historians have very differing opinions as to whether or not Hitler did truly have EL at some point, but there's no denying that he certainly had some form of Parkinsonism, which, if you remember, was often a long lasting chronic effect of EL. But the question with Hitler has always been, was this your standard Parkinson's disease, or was it post-encephalitic? We do know that Hitler was a very sickly man. He had frequent bowel issues, probably what would be diagnosed as IBS today. We know he had coronary artery disease and or hypertensive heart disease. He may have suffered a small heart attack in July 1941. You kind of wish it had been a larger heart attack, don't you? His heart just really wasn't in a good way, and nor was anything else in his body, it seems. It's also been documented that he suffered with photosensitivity, tinnitus, headaches, and insomnia, but also sleep inversion. He fell asleep well after midnight and often woke up very late morning. Some people are just night owls, or it could be a symptom of long-lasting EL. In the last couple of decades of his life, Hitler's health was slowly declining, and he was constantly on this cocktail of drugs. In the years before his death, rumours of his ill health were circulating, but he was very careful about letting any evidence of this get out. In fact, his Parkinsonism was only made public just weeks before his death. And I want to make it very clear here that these symptoms are not what got him. That's not what killed him. Hitler chose to end his own life by gunshot after Germany's defeat. Obviously, that's a huge nutshell here, but everything that led up to his death could be a whole episode in itself. Analysis of footage in the few years before his death found that he first showed signs of hypermobility, slight paralysis in his left arm in 1941, which then progressed to his left leg and then right arm. From 1943, he showed a disturbed gait, he wasn't walking normally, and the next year, a very obvious tremor appeared. He tried his hardest to hide this from the public, but it can be quite clearly seen in old footage. His left hand was badly affected by this. He would often keep it hidden away in his pocket, or he'd clasp it with his right hand to keep it still. As time went on, it was very clear that he was suffering with rigidity as well, a very stooped posture and a shuffling gait, all the signs of Parkinsonism. From 1940 onwards, he stopped making as many public appearances. He actually only spoke publicly 7 times that year on significant military occasions. From 1943 onwards, he only did 2 public speeches, and then in 1944, he disappeared completely from the public view. Sure, he could have been preoccupied with the war effort, especially in the later years, as it just wasn't going his way, but some suspect that his Parkinsonism got so bad that he just couldn't be in public any longer. It's really interesting because so much of his success, and I say that in air quotes for my podcast listeners, I'm not saying success in a good way, just like general. He was the leader of a country. Success in leading Germany came because of his ability to command an audience. He had this power, he had this charisma, he had this way with words. So without these public appearances, these very powerful speeches that he made in the early days of his reign, he did begin to lose public support. If he wasn't ill, would he have taken this risk? Would he have stopped appearing and stopped making his speeches? Because that, at the end of the day, was where a lot of his power lied. In doing the research for this episode, I ended up falling down a rabbit hole of why Hitler's speeches were so powerful. What was it about the way he spoke that got people to just cling on to his every word? How was he able to make people lose all their morals? And some people literally think that he had a hypnotic effect, literally hypnosis. It's fascinating. It could be a whole video in itself, but I thought that was really interesting. But as I was saying, our big question around Hitler is, was it Parkinson's disease that he had, or was it Parkinsonism caused by encephalitis lethargica? In November 1918, at 29 years old, Hitler was caught in a mustard gas attack while serving as a runner in World War I. He had to be treated in hospital. He spent time in the neurology and psychiatry ward, which is not usually where somebody of such an attack would be treated. And then many of his symptoms later in life, as I mentioned earlier, do match up with post-encephalitic Parkinsonism. There's no actual evidence of EL here, but we know that he did have Parkinsonism symptoms. In a study of more than 800 patients with Parkinsonism performed at Columbia from 1949 to 1969, idiopathic Parkinsonism, so no known cause, accounted for 84% of cases, whilst post-encephalitic Parkinsonism accounted for 12%. However, this would have been considerably higher in the 1940s and the years directly after EL. And whether you got it or not did depend on your age as well. The average age for onset of idiopathic Parkinsonism was 55 plus 11 years, whilst for post-encephalitic Parkinsonism was 28 plus 9 years, so significantly younger. At the time of the gas attack, Hitler was around 29 years old when he was in hospital. As far as the public are aware, he was around 53 years old when he started showing obvious signs of the disease, although that is only publicly. It could have reared its head much younger. So all in all, that doesn't really give us much information. He hid a lot from the public, obviously. It is interesting to ponder how Hitler's illness affected the outcome of the war and his general actions throughout it. Some suspect that he was always preoccupied with the passage of time, about running out of time to achieve his goals, and so it's thought that if he recognised that he did have this physical disability, this degenerative physical disability, that may have caused him to go to war much more quickly than he may have done otherwise, before the military and industry was really up to the levels in Germany that they needed to be. This also may have hastened his decision to invade the Soviet Union in June 1941 while still engaged in war with England, which is not thought to have been one of his best choices. A lot of his military failures in the last few years of his life could be partly attributed to his Parkinsonism, and researchers have done a lot of research into this. Depression, anxiety, apathy, psychosis, hallucinations, memory problems, dementia, and impulsive and compulsive behaviours. These have all been attributed to Parkinsonism. How much was this having an effect on his mind, on the choices he made during the war? Some people around him say that he was very indecisive and struggled to adapt to the ever-changing landscape of war. Others say this is bullshit. He only showed a mental decline in the days before his death. Maybe he wasn't decisive, maybe that's just who he was as a person, or maybe it was because of Parkinsonism. And I absolutely do not want anyone to think that I am diminishing Hitler's responsibility in the war because of potential Parkinsonism. Like, that is not what I'm saying. He made awful, horrible choices years before any symptoms started to show. Like, his political views had long been in place before he joined the Nazi Party in 1920. He was always determined to make things happen, to do what he was going to do. It's more of a question of what impact did these possible neurological symptoms have on his decisions in the active years of the war. It's not always helpful to retrospectively diagnose historical figures, and whilst Hitler's Parkinsonism is undisputed, like he definitely had it, you can't superimpose his symptoms on something as complex as the war. This involved an enormous amount of characters, a mixture of political events and interests, all coming together for this perfect bomb to go off in this moment. Speculation is interesting. It's interesting to ponder on what if he didn't have Parkinsonism, like what could have been different about the war? Would he have made different choices? Like, would he have not been as rash to make some of the choices that he made? At the end of the day, we don't know, but it's interesting to ponder on. At the end of the day, he wasn't going to come out and admit to the public that he had a degenerative disease, so we don't know how aware he was of what was going on. Did he know he was ill and what was going to happen in the future? At what point did he become aware of this? Was this a factor in his decision making? Did he make things move faster than he might have otherwise done? We simply don't know. It would have undermined his power to talk publicly about this. There's no answer, there's no way of knowing, but it sure is interesting to think about. If encephalitis lethargica hadn't hit, could the world look very different now? We don't know. And I think we will end on that very uplifting note. To this day, we have no answers as to what caused encephalitis lethargica. We don't know if it's an epidemic that we will ever see again. Because if we don't know what caused it, we don't know how to stop it, and then we don't know how to treat it. Because sporadic cases are so rare, there's been able to be such little research into treatments. There are certain therapies and treatments that can be done to fix sort of more specific symptoms of EL, but nothing to fix the disease overall. Apparently steroids do help a bit, but they're not going to fix it. If you survive long enough with the EL, the disease does tend to show very similar evidence of brain damage, similar to, but not the same as, Parkinson's. So the anti-Parkinson's drugs do tend to help a little bit, if only for a very short period of time. So yeah, it's a pretty scary disease, and if you do survive, you're probably going to be suffering with lifelong symptoms. It's really not great, so let's cross all our fingers that encephalitis lethargica is gone. Whatever caused it is gone, it's not going to come back. But like I said, throughout history, it has come back about once every century at different parts of Europe. A huge thank you to Emma for sponsoring this video. I've had this topic on my list to cover for such a long time, and then when they came along about sponsorship, I was like, I've got the perfect topic. I've got the perfect video. I was so excited. It worked. It just worked really well. So please make sure you check them out in the top line description box down below. Honestly, this duvet is so comfy. It is so comfy. I love it so much. If you've watched all the way to the end, then make sure to interact with this video in any way you can. Like, comment, subscribe, that'd be great. If you want to be really great, you can become a channel member for just £2.99 a month and join my little community over there. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.